Well, my topic I've made just a little more specific. As you see here, I'll be speaking as a linguist today about language change in progress, language change on a very large scale. The first study I did of change in progress in the island of Martha's Vineyard was concerned with a community small enough for everyone to know everyone else's name. And my account of the social motivation of sound change is cited as a paradigmatic case of a language feature reinforcing local identity. In recent years, many excellent studies have been done by the microanalysis of face-to-face interaction in small groups, attempting to tease out the social meaning of linguistic variables. In studies of the social stratification of language in larger cities that Peter just referred to, New York and Philadelphia, I've tried to see how social networks generalize to the uniform pattern of the metropolis. However, our recently completed atlas, that again was just mentioned, shows ongoing change involving vast areas and populations who have no contact with each other and no knowledge of the nature or size of the current that's carrying them along. To try to understand how and why this is happening, I've drawn upon the help of scholars in a field that I'm at best an amateur, the history of American religious and political thought over the past 2 centuries. And I'm particularly grateful for the contributions of Lee Benson, Walter McDougall, and Christopher Gray, among others who have attempted to point me in the right direction. So, first of all, I don't have a handout, but I do and will put this up tonight on my home page, which is listed here, so that in case there's anything here you want to look up, it'll be available as a PowerPoint display. The argument that I'm going to put forward begins by stating that the northern city shift is a rotation of 6 vowels that have radically altered the vowel systems of the Great Lake region. And the triggering event for this shift took place in western New York during the construction of the Erie Canal, when a variety of dialect differences were leveled in a general raising and fronting of short A words. As we'll see. The direction of these changes, the changes that followed, can be accounted for by general principles of chain shifting of vowels, linguistic factors, as well as by the tendency for maximum dispersion in vowel subsystems. Yet, the coincidence of the northern city shift territory with the blue states of the last 2 presidential elections leads us to look further into the cultural patterns of northern settlement history. So the second part of the argument, and I'm looking forward here, is this. The formative period of the sound changes coincided with the Second Great Awakening, a period of intense evangelical activity with a strong focus on the abolition of slavery. And although the cultural style of these Yankee evangelists was similar to that of the New Christian Right today, the region defined by their modern linguistic legacy is now dominated by liberal democratic voting. The reversal of Republican and Democratic voting patterns in the North and South appears to have been motivated by the Democratic Party's endorsement of civil rights legislation. If that's so, the same ideological opposition may be associated with the northern city shift and the sharp linguistic differentiation across the North Midland line. Now, I'll try to put some flesh on these bones by showing you what this northern city shift is. And I'm going to use an experimental technique that we developed in the 1980s, an experiment that asked the question, does language change interfere with communication? And to test this, we took speakers from 3 cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Birmingham, Alabama. Took extreme examples of the sound changes that were developing in those areas, and saw then later followed through with experiments using the very same groups, listening to each themselves and listening to people from other cities. This particular page concerns only Chicago. And what we did was first play isolated words. I'm going to play one for you now. You'll be subjects of the experiment.
Black, black.
So your job is to write down what you hear. Then, later on in the series, when they're all finished, they heard a phrase.
Living on one black, living on one black.
And then, finally, a sentence.
Old senior citizens living on one black.
So people became aware, and they began to laugh just as you are, that something strange here. There are people who are saying the word block the way they say black. And then a second element.
Sacks, sacks, were sacks. Yet it were sacks, no sandals.
And this is parallel. You just discovered that what you thought was sacks was really intended to be socks.
Were sacks.
Yet.
A very difficult sound, but when you hear it in context, it sounds like this.
Scared of Viet, scared of Viet,
Sorry.
scared of Viet. And so nobody really got scared of Viet.
So she was saying nobody really got scared of Viet. And that Viet is the way that the people in this area pronounce the word that you say most
Scared
of
of
that.
Viet.
Desk, desk, behind the desk. So I like that, sitting behind the desk.
And finally, I'm going to play this example.
Bosses,
And almost everybody writes down, as you might do, B-O-S-S-E-S. And then you hear about the
bosses with the antennas.
and you wonder, who are these bosses with the antennas?
Shook
And
her
finally,
head.
you hear,
I can remember vaguely when we had the bosses with the antennas on the top.
and you realize that she was pronouncing the word buses the way many people here would pronounce bosses. So this is a radical rotation of 6 vowels, and I'll show you now a little bit of what that system looks like. This is the Northern City shift laid out in a way that you can follow the movement of these words. The first thing that happened, that the words that are spelled with short A, which we write in linguistics as ash, instead of saying as mat, sounded like
Matt.
And the second state, that behind that, the words that are spelled with short O moved into the vacuum that's created by that spot.
Black, sacks.
And then next, the words that are pronounced as boss in other areas moved down to sound like
Boss.
Finally, in other things that were happening in the system in compensating is that the short E, which was now rubbing up against this mat, moved down into the area that is occupied by used to be occupied by short A,
Had.
or to the back
Desk.
towards dusk. And finally, as you heard,
Bosses,
the sound that we show as, we write in this way as a wedge, short U,
bosses,
moves backwards. So what I'm trying to get across to you is a phonological space with peripheral and non-peripheral tracks. And those of you who have not spent many delightful hours studying phonetics will still be introduced by the fact that there's a structure here. There are front and back vowels, and there are high and low vowels, and they go into this triangular space which we can measure. And I want to just indicate to you that the high front area is vowels we spell as beat, with the tongue in a high front position. And the color indicates that the differentiation of these sounds, of these vowels, is really like the color of an instrument. So beat is high in front, boot is low in back, and if you say beat and boot at the same pitch, you'll discover that boot sounds lower. Beat, boot. So boot is in the high back region, and then the other corner of this triangle is occupied by block. So it is the rotation in this space that occurs, but they're actually in the Western Germanic languages, such as the English that we speak, there's 2 tracks in the front and 2 tracks in the back. And the generalization is that when language change begins, you rise in the front peripheral track or the back peripheral track, and you fall in the center. So this is what the system looks like when we lay on top of it. We see there are 2 kinds of structural principles involved here. First, there's a game of musical chairs. The first change moves short A from cat to cat, and then short O, cot, moves up towards cat, and then caught moves down towards cot. The other thing that controls this kind of operation is the general principles that say that vowels that are long or tense move upwards. So cat becomes cat, 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 and cat. Whereas the vowels that are short and lax begin to fall in a darkness that we call the center. So bit becomes but, bet becomes but becomes bot. So these are structural principles which are not the main topic of our discussion, but I wanted to bring them forward because the major changes that we're talking about are governed by such structural principles, and we can explain a great deal about them by these internal factors. Now I want to play for you a speaker, so you hear a speaker as a whole. This is one of the people who's presented in our atlas samples. And what you're going to hear is the fronting of short O in got and job, pronounced got and job, and the raising of short A towards the end where she says a heart attack and coming back.
The way I got hired for this one job was really weird because I went in for a secretarial position is what I went in for. Oh. And they had hired somebody else that didn't know anything, but it was a buyer's daughter, so that she got the job. And they called me because I had done shipping and receiving as far as the paperwork, and they asked me if I'd help out because their shipper just had a heart attack and she wasn't coming back for a while.
Now, it's important to note here that the inland north does not show the sharp social stratification that you find in New York, Philadelphia, and the South. These phonetic forms are heard from people of all social levels. If you hear the novelist Scott Turow from Chicago, you'll hear vowels just like this. And the actress Lily Tomlin from Rochester will sound just like this, when she's speaking for herself, not for some other part. There are some gender and class differences in our quantitative studies in the realization of this northern city shift, but very little style shifting. My colleague Sherry Ash, who's here today, has done some careful studies of the difference between reading word lists and speaking spontaneously, as you just heard, and it's quite minimal in this whole region. There's no public awareness of the shift at all. Nobody in this vast area of these 88 million people has any notion of what's happening. So it's a large-scale phenomenon. The northern city shift is found throughout the inland north. It's an area of roughly 88,000 square miles, a population of over 34 million speakers, and they're all moving in the same direction. This is what it looks like. This is not a map. This is a photograph taken by Defense Department satellites in the 1960s, showing the heat and light that's given off at night, and the size of the city is reflected by the size of these orange areas. So what we have here is the inland north is the region that I've outlined in red, and we have the cities of Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, Toledo, Flint, Grand Rapids, Chicago, Joliet, Kenosha, Milwaukee. And on the other hand, across on the other side of that line is what we call the Midland. There is Columbus, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, Indianapolis, Kansas City, Omaha, all Midland cities, and St. Louis, which is quite different for reasons that we can note. So this is a lot of cities. They're huge cities. You can tell that the urban north is far more urban, heavily populated than the Midland area, though it has some big cities. They're quite scattered around by comparison. Now this is a map from the Atlas showing you just how precise and clean this division is between the North and the Midland. What we see here is brown dots, which are represented, those people are saying bosses for buses, where becomes all. And it's measured a certain quantity, 1450 hertz, but the important point is how sharp the line is between the brown dots and the Midland area below, which has got only 1-2 points of that sort, and the rest are solidly yellow, indicating that they don't have that feature. And the red line represents the people who say mat and that, as you just heard, and these two features coincide quite closely on the North Midland boundary, which is the one that we're following down here. Just a little outline of the names of the dialects that have been assigned by the Atlas. As a result of 5 or 6 years of analysis, we come to the conclusion that the United States has much the same areas that were originally defined by Hans Kurrat in the eastern United States. We have the north, this large area, and inside it, the inland north. The inland north is defined as that region which has the northern city shift in its full form, as I've just shown you. And south of that is this large area called the Midland, which is most of Ohio, almost all of Indiana, 2/3 of Illinois, and then moving out into northern Missouri and southern Iowa. So we'll be talking about the opposition between the North and the Midland. But to show you an idea of how this opposition is developed, here is a scattergram showing you measurements of the wedge vowels, the short U, in the North and the Midland. So if we go to, the horizontal axis is age, and the older speakers are on the right. The vertical axis is the measurement of this, how far back this vowel is, so that when you're saying bosses, you're way down at the bottom of the scale, and when you're saying bosses, you're way up at the top. So we see that the older speakers in the Midland and the older speakers in the North are about the same. There is not much difference. But if you go to the younger speakers, that's where the Midland is, and this is where the North is. They're quite different. And that's some idea of the degree of divergence that's occurring over the last 3 generations. And just to emphasize this, here is the fronted short U.
Bus, bus, bus,
Bus.
bus.
And here is the backed short U,
Bosses, bosses,
which you heard before. So this gives us a pretty clear notion of the fact that there's a sharp line between the North and the Midland, and this differentiation is becoming greater and greater. So the next step is, as indicated in my argument, is to note, it's hard to miss the fact that this region, which we call the blue states from the 2004 presidential election, includes a couple of states in the West which were heavily settled by Northerners, and the northern areas that you see in blue. You're all familiar with that. But I'll then superimpose upon that, now looking gray, those 2 boundaries we talked about. The dashed line is the inland north, which is the full development of the northern city shift, and the dark outline is the north more generally, which is, you might say, the conditions under which the northern city shift develops. This is some indication of how that numerical idea, you're looking at a crude map when you're looking at states, because it doesn't quite fit, and the states are, New York is after all divided into this New York City and the rest, and so on, and linguistic boundaries do not match state boundaries, they never do. But we counted counties, and we look at the county votes, and what I've done here is to sum up the counties that were within the inland north, the counties that are in the larger north, the counties in the Midland, and counties in New England, just those 4 areas. And we look at the Kerry majority and the Bush majority. For the inland north, we have 20-6. The north generally, 15-7, not quite so strong. The Midland, the reverse, 8-13. And New England is the strongest for Kerry. So this gives us a little closer idea of this coincidence or match, which may be accidental, between the linguistic behavior and the political pattern. It certainly got me interested. So here is a closer view, a scattergram, where I've got all the counties that we just talked about laid out on a map in which the total county vote is on the vertical axis, and a logarithmic scale, as we often need for population figures. And then the horizontal axis is the percent Kerry vote by county. So here is, if you're a strong Bushite, you're on this left, Kerry votes are on the right. The yellow squares represent Midland counties. And you can see they are almost all on the Bush side, and they're quite distinct from the blue areas. The dark blue circles are those that are within the inland north, and they're the biggest cities. They're Chicago up the top. So they're the biggest cities by far. And the light blue are the northern areas, which don't have so many big cities, the surrounding region. And then the square blue represents New England over here, with the strongest Kerry vote. Now you can see there are two factors operating here. One is the size of the community as shown by the total vote. And the other is the left-right dimension is reflecting which dialect you're speaking. Here's a regression analysis which shows us something of interest. If we just focus on the regression, what you're trying to explain here is percent vote for Kerry or a county. And the different dialect groups are independent variables. So we have the north and the inland north being circled there. North is a little stronger than the inland north, it's 8-6. And then down the bottom, you see this huge factor for size of total county vote. That is, the vote for Kerry was largely urban, and the bigger the city, the stronger the vote. In both the Midland and the other areas. Now I should add that the residual group, as I mentioned here, is Midland. So everything is being compared to Midland, and there's a significant advantage for a Kerry vote in the north, the inland north, and by size of county vote. Now if we should say, forget about the size of county vote, and just look at the dialect area, we find that suddenly the inland north becomes more dominant. 9-8 is the factor there. And that would say that if you didn't pay attention to how big the city was, you'd still be impressed by the fact that the biggest Kerry vote is coming from inland north speakers. So, I wanted to ask the question, then, where did the northern city shift come from? I want to plunge back into the history of this affair. This is a map of the settlement patterns of the eastern and central United States as mapped by Fred Kniffen and Henry Glassy, cultural geographers who are working primarily with data from log cabin construction and wood house construction generally. And they found there's a stream of settlement coming out of New England, the northern settlement that you see there, and then there's a Pennsylvania stream which comes from the Philadelphia area, but also the Scots-Irish settlement that goes into what we call the borderlands, going down in this region here, called the Upland South, with a strong upward movement. Now, the people who moved into Ohio and Indiana were both from the Pennsylvania area, the Scots-Irish from Pennsylvania, and also from the Scotch border areas. And then down the bottom you see the coastal area being settled by Virginia, and the southern plantation owners never moved too far west. Now this maps pretty well with David Hackett Fisher's account in Albion's Seed of the 4 cultural hearths that came from England. But more importantly, you can see that the boundary between that dark northern settlement area and the Midland area is pretty close to the linguistic pattern that we have today. And we can see that more closely. We have the north, the Midland, and the upland south. Much of what we'll be talking about is going to merge discussions of upland southerners or Appalachians and Midlanders, because the two populations were quite mixed. And we want to go back to saying, when did that northern settlement pattern start? And the key event was the construction of the Erie Canal from 1817, when it was first begun, to 1825, when it was finished. And once that happened, Philadelphia, the largest city, our own city, the most important city in the United States, became second run to New York. New York passed it with a rush. That's because the Delaware River freezes over in the winter, and it wasn't suitable for a canal building. And the Hudson River is an estuary, a saltwater estuary, which never freezes over, and that's one of the many reasons that the canal was constructed. And the canal had an extraordinary effect upon America. With, first of all, the big cities, we talked about Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo, rose on that, but the impact of the Erie Canal was greater than that, even that. As this little note from the Erie Canal Brief History says, the impact on the rest of the state can be seen by looking at a modern map. With the exception of Binghamton and Elmira, every major city in New York falls along the trade route established by the Erie Canal from New York City to Albany through Schenectady, Utica, and Syracuse to Rochester and Buffalo. Nearly 80% of upstate New York's population lives within 25 miles of the Erie Canal. And in a study of Cortland County, it was found that the Cortland County people couldn't afford to compete with the Ohio grain merchants anymore because the time and the effort it took to travel more than 30 miles to the Erie Canal was less than it would take to ship it from Ohio to New York City. So land transportation was painfully slow and expensive compared to water transportation. No established village had ever mushroomed so rapidly as Rochester, growing from 1507 to 9207 within a 10-year span. And here is a map showing you that extraordinary growth of Rochester and its surrounding counties. And down there you see where the Erie Canal was first built. So this explosion of population led to, I believe, a hypothesis, the formation of what we call a koine, that is a common language named after the Greek koine, among settlers of western New York State. Now, again, I'm going to be using this framework to talk about short A patterns, which are going to move from either low front position down here, A, to high front position, Ia. A common phenomenon throughout the United States, and the most common pattern in this pattern here is shown here. This is the nasal short A system found in New England and in the West, and as a default system in many areas. It says that you will use the Ia pronunciation, or air, only before nasal consonants M and N. So what you hear in this particular speaker from Providence, Rhode Island,
Dan,
as opposed, and also
Alabama.
Now you're used to a city here in Philadelphia where we say Dan, but Alabama in open syllables. But in this particular nasal system, which is so common, all other words are pronounced back, cash, bag, laugh, way down there. So this enormous gulf between these two types. But this is opposed to another system from New Britain, Connecticut, which is continuous. The nasal consonants outlined here, you see, are a little bit advance of the oral consonants, but it's all one continuum. But a third common, the one that we're so familiar with in New York and Philadelphia, is quite different. We have now divided this group into two different phonemes shown by the orange triangles and the red squares being quite different. And we have ham, but am, way down there. We have said and bad, but we have had. And that's just the beginning of the complexity of the New York City system. So there were people from New York coming up with this system, mixing with those with the nasal system, those from Boston. And what we have is this. Into the area of the Erie Canal came people speaking with the nasal system, with the Boston system, with this continuous system I just showed you, and with the split New York City system. And it formed the koine of this type, where we find Sharon K. from Rochester.
Mattress.
Whoops. And then the least advanced of these forms is not last, but last. So that wholesale raising was the end result of a mixture in the koine form, and that is what triggered off that extraordinary shift that I exposed you to at the beginning. So all a became air. Now let's look at the western expansion of that system. This is a lexical boundary drawn from the data on the Dictionary of American Regional Atlas by Craig Carver. And I've spread out from east to west a lot of lexical oppositions, even though there is no east-west dimension. I just spread them out to be able to read them. So we find all these words that differentiate the North from the Midlands. Stone fence is against rock fence. Elastic band is against gum band. Belly flop is against belly buster. Stone boat is against mud boat. Blat versus ball for a calf. Code versus sheepy when you're calling a sheep, and so on. Well, you'll notice that these are not only mostly agricultural and rural terms, but they're quite obsolete. Most of you don't know any of them. And so that makes you think this is the reflex of that settlement that we talked about before. People carrying from New England their vocabulary or their Pennsylvania, Philadelphia vocabulary westward. But it would make you think that the dialect differences would have died out because all these words have died out. They have no relevance to modern life whatsoever. So the terms that define, that reflect the dialect differences of the 1830s are pretty well gone. But we come today, the same dialect boundary shown by the black and white area coincides almost exactly with the modern day development that I've just exposed you to. The brown dots again represent people who are saying boss for bus. And you see how clean the difference is and how tightly I've actually bundled together 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different measures of the North as against the Midland. So it's one of the sharpest linguistic division in the North American continent. But just to indicate again that here's a westward version. This is Kenosha, Wisconsin. And Martha F. in Kenosha says, MAT is
Matt.
and handy is,
Handy.
and just as we heard from the speaker in Chicago, sock becomes,
Back.
and hot becomes.
Hat.
So this is some indication. Now, the great linguistic uniformity of the inland North and its sharp separation from the Midland implies that the dialect was transmitted faithfully from parents to children over many generations. For this to happen, it appears to be essential that communities remain intact as they migrate. The uniformity of the North and the heterogeneity of the Midland cities correspond to marked differences in the size of the migrating unit. So let's look at Yankee and Midland settlement patterns. Mass migrations were indeed congenial to the Puritan tradition, says Richard Power in his study of Corn Belt culture. Whole parishes, parson and all, had sometimes migrated from Old England. Lois Kimball Matthews mentioned 22 colonies in Illinois alone, all of which originated in New England or New York, most of them planted between 1830 and 1840. So Tim Fraser, in this book, Heartland English, I'm going to cite quite a few times, says the upland Southerners left behind, in contrary, a loose social structure of rural neighborhoods based on kinship. When upland Southerners migrated as individuals or in individual families, the neighborhood was left behind. So you have two radically different situations. And here is David Hackett Fisher's summary, a table from the back of his book. I've just taken out the Yankee and Midland areas and classified by settlement. Yankee settled in towns, the Midland in isolated clusters. The Yankees built their houses right by the roadside of the avenue. The Midlands went up to the creek and spring little backwater areas. The internal migration of the Yankees were low. Once they settled, whereas the Midland people kept moving at very high. And their persistence is another measure of the same thing. So now let's talk about the cultural styles as described by the historians of these two groups. Here is the Yankee Confession as put together by Thomas Moraine in his study of Iowa, contact between the Yankees and the Midland people in Iowa. First of all, life is a struggle, a test of will. The individual, not the government or any other social unit, is responsible for his or her own well-being. Success is a measure of character. And finally, the righteous are responsible for the welfare of the community. While conversion of the sinner to the higher path was the preferable means of reform, it was sometimes necessary to use the legal authority of the state by making immoral activities illegal. That is, prohibition, blue laws, abortion control, and so on. Now, here is Power's view, of the Indiana student, of the meddling Yankee. And this is a little bit hostile. You begin to get the idea these guys really didn't like the Yankees. Taxed with being busybodies and meddlers, apologists own that the instinct for meddling, as divine as that of self-preservation, runs in the Yankee blood. That the typical New Englander was entirely unable, when there were wrongs to be corrected, to mind his own business. Right? That's a typical, but the Yankee view of the Midland was a little bit the opposite. So history of McLean County, it says, in McLean County, Illinois, the Northerner thought of the Southerner as a lean, lank, lazy critter, burrowing in a hut and rioting in whiskey, dirt, and ignorance. But here's a Yankee historian who actually confirms what these Midland historians had to say. He says Stuart Holbrook, along with their crackers, their codfish, and their theology, all three very important, they carried their peculiar ideas of government and managed, in spite of Kentucky statutes in Illinois, to impose their township system throughout the state. They did the same to or for Michigan, and also established a whipping post, in words taken from Vermont's original laws. Let's listen to Henry Ward Beecher at the height of this conflict in 1865. We are to have charge of this continent. The South has been proved and has been found wanting. She is not worthy to bear rule. She has lost the scepter in our national government, and she is to lose the scepter in the states themselves. And this continent is to be from this time forth governed by northern men with northern ideas and with a northern gospel. All right? That is pretty strong words, but that's the voice of the northern abolitionists. But they also operated on language. So Power reports that at Greensburg in southeastern Indiana, the Reverend J.R. Wheelock advised his eastern sponsors that his wife had opened a school of 20 or 30 scholars in which he would use the most approved New England school books to be obtained by a local merchant from Philadelphia. She makes defining a distinct branch of study, and this gives her a very favorable opportunity of correcting the children and through them the parents of a heap of Kentuckyisms. Right? So the Yankees were meddling with this. But Tim Fraser is a linguist, very fine linguist, who edited this book, and he is the strongest in his reaction to Yankee patterns. He says, we must learn what led to the establishment of Inland Northern as a prestige dialect in the Great Lakes region. What he's so angry about is that George Kenyon wrote a book called American Pronunciation, and then wrote a guide for NBC, the NBC Guide to Pronunciation, which was generalized to other networks, which took the Chicago dialect as a model for correct pronunciation. We need to understand as well why scholars like Kenyon, George Philip Krapp, and Hans Kurrat embraced the concept of Inland Northern as a general American. Of course, today Tim is quite happy because the Northern City Shift has changed that dialect so much that it couldn't lay claim to that at all. But perhaps, says Tim, the language of Yankee cultural imperialism, that's where I got my title, was appropriate for a century of corporate expansion, leveraged buyouts, and American military intervention in the Philippines, Central America, the Caribbean, Vietnam, and the Middle East. Okay, so this is the portrait of the Yankees as vile reactionaries. But we'll see that doesn't hold water. Because if we look at in Yankee ideology and American reform movements, we have this quotation. Imbued with the notion that there is a superior vision, Yankees dutifully accepted their responsibility for the moral and intellectual life of the nation, with or without an invitation from the uneducated, the undisciplined, the disinterested, or the unmotivated. But going a little further, cultural uplift, Yankee style, also meant attacking sin and sloth. The initial settlement of Iowa coincided with 3 very active decades for American reform movements: health fads, prison reform, women's rights, crusades for new standards of dress. The northern states teemed with advocates of one cause or another, and you get the way every word is loaded. Teemed is a pretty loaded word. Most important among the reform movements of the day were the issues of abolition and temperance, says Moraine. Wait a minute. That doesn't sound like a health fad. Abolition is pretty important. We'll return to that. And I just want to give some notion that Tim Fraser was perhaps on the wrong track when he talked about the Yankee ideology being such a reactionary force. Because here we've looked at the red and blue states. But now I'd like to look at another aspect of the situation, the development well, let me show you what I've done here. This table gives a view of the evolution of the North-South opposition. For each election year, I've entered under the northern column a D or an R if all of the states listed voted Democrat or Republican. That is, in the North, the states would be New York, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. And in the South, same thing if all the states listed here were voted either Democrat or Republican. If one state is missing, it's parenthesized. If more than one state is missing, a slash indicates a split. Now, the colored blocks show those years in which there was a clear opposition of North versus South. From 1856 through 1924, we observe a consistent pattern of Southern Democrats opposed to Northern Republicans. Then a transitional period with both Democratic and Republican landslides with considerable splitting of the Southern Democrats. In the Ford election of 1988, there's a clear reversal of the North-South alignment, with the Republicans now in the South and Democrats in the North. These are well-known facts, and there are many people in this room who understand the history and causes of this reversal better than I do. I just want to use this panorama to raise the question as to whether the ideologies of these two regions have also switched, or whether there's an ideological continuity that matches the linguistic continuity displayed by the Northern City shift. Now, to do this, I'd like to explore the regional pattern of another ideological issue with political consequences, the abolition or installation of the death penalty. So here is the role of the northern states. Here's the beginning. 1846 to 1876 was the first wave of death penalty abolition in Iowa, Wisconsin, partially in Michigan, and in Maine. The first wave of death penalty abolition receded, and only Wisconsin and Michigan was left. In 1887, Maine reinstituted or reabolished the death penalty. In 1897 and 1915, there was a second wave of death penalty abolition, and all the states that you see there have abolished this death penalty, but now a second wave of restoration in 1916 and 1939. So we're still left with this core of northern states. The third wave of death penalty abolition began in 1957 to 1969, again with our northern states at the core, but then, 72, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that the death penalty was cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the 8th and 14th Amendments. So if you wanted to reinstitute the death penalty, you had to write legislation that satisfied the Supreme Court's requirements. And here's the result. Every one of those pink states restored the death penalty, and the numbers indicate for how many crimes the death penalty was appropriate. The ones in white said no. They refused to pass such legislation, and they retained, and that's the origin of our current situation with 12 states on the mainland with no death penalty, no death penalty being possible. So one of the many attitudes that are regarded as liberal has to do with the death penalty. And what you're seeing here, that it's nothing new in the North. We're going back to 1846 when this pattern was first instituted. So it appears the inland North has maintained a consistent bias against the death penalty from 1846, coinciding with the linguistic territory of the northern city shift. So I'd like now to consider the evolution of a parallel social ideology, the attitude towards slavery, its restriction and abolition. It'll be remembered that one of the fads and reform issues that Moraine associated with the Yankees was abolition. The history of this development has been richly documented by scholars who are less hostile to the Yankee tradition. First, I should point out that the parallels between the Yankee reformers and the new Christian right was noted by Cowardine in the introduction to his study of evangelical politics. In the 19th century, he says, evangelical Protestants, to a degree unrivaled since the Civil War, have now thrust themselves into the political mainstream, moving away from the political fringes that they inhabited for much of the first two-thirds of this century. The ideological divisiveness and bitter political conflicts of the 1970s and 1980s, like those of the antebellum years, were rooted in divergent religious and ethical undertakings. So this parallel of style is unmistakable. But when we return to that Western New York where the Koine was formed, and we learn about the burned-over district, this is the most intense area of religious enthusiasm. In the 18th century, America was not a very religious country. In the 19th century, beginning in 1912, these revivalist movements were immensely popular. Entire communities of young New Englanders emigrated to the area of New York west of the Adirondack and Catskill Mountains, arriving in western New York often by means of the Erie Canal. The restless settlers of the burned-over districts readily sought release in millennial and communitarian religion. That's Carnus and Garrity. And slavery was the central issue in the burned-over districts. So Whitney Cross, who wrote the definitive book on the burned-over district, says, in February 1841, an interdenominational convention adopted a totally ultraist position. The ultraists were the most extreme of the anti-slavery people, condemning the Baptist Register and all others who acknowledged evil without taking action, and concluded that the abolition cause must prevail before the halcyon day of millennial glory can dawn upon the world. And one of the ways a preacher declared himself to be a good person was by the force with which they condemned slavery. No other section of the country would, throughout the years before the Civil War, prove to be so thoroughly and constantly sensitive to anti-slavery agitation. As the major issue of the century, furthermore, this crusade attracted more attention than others. Now, there's a distinction made between pietists and liturgicals, which is important to follow because these are the ancestors of our present democratic and republican construction. Richard Carwardine, who is the author of Evangelicals and Politics in Antebellum America, says that the liturgicals stress the positive values of the institutionalized formalities of the old orthodoxies. They were for church structure. Pietists were revivalists, emphasizing the experience of personal conversion and flatly rejecting ritualism. Pietists worked for Sunday blue laws, the abolition of saloons, and before the Civil War, a check to the growth of slavery or even its abolition. Now here's the important paragraph. When American political parties reformed to an opposition between Republicans and Democrats around 1850, the great majority of pietists entered the Republican Party, while the great majority of liturgicals became Democrats. Now, the Democratic position, summed up by Carwardine, was designed to appeal to lower-class rural folk, particularly but not exclusively in the rural South, who deeply resented the imperialism of the Yankee missionaries. We've seen plenty of that. Their schemes for temperance, Sunday schools, and other reforms. On the other hand, the Republican position, as summarized by Carwardine, is the emergence and ultimate success of the Republicans were dependent on a particular understanding of politics, one which evangelicals had played a major role in shaping. That political ethic was rooted in the theology of the Second Great Awakening, marked by an optimistic post-millennialism and an urgent appeal to disinterested action. Frequently, the people who were defined as altruists or pietists believed in perfectionism. They would not tolerate an imperfect world. They could not tolerate a world in which slavery existed. They had to do something about it. Now, I want to be careful not to suggest that the Yankee ideology and those who objected to it were overwhelming forces, dictating how people should vote. Throughout the period we're studying, Democrats and Republicans were so closely balanced, and elections would oscillate around back and forth with very close votes. For example, the Republican percent of the vote shown here from 1880 to 1896 was just below or just above 50%. The row representing urban Yankees and urban non-Yankee counties is shown here, walking right across for every election. And you'll see that the urban counties with Yankee population varied from 49 to 55%, never more than 6% greater than the Republican vote in non-Yankee urban counties. So the Yankee vote was a crucial factor for GOP success in 5 elections, but did not succeed in 3. So we're dealing with a very closely balanced situation where a small push one way or the other will make a big difference. So returning to this remarkable reversal We'd like to understand how it came about. Now, many of you have probably thought about this, and I'm sure there are many answers to it. But I was struck recently by a conversation that was recorded by Walter Beschloss that he found between John F. Kennedy and Russell B. Long, the senator from Louisiana. This was 1960. Kennedy was one of the many people who was on the fence. He was introducing a Civil Rights Act into Congress, but he wasn't sure whether it was worth the price, because it seemed to him that if he did this, he would lose the Southern vote and lose this next election. So he had debated to himself, particularly resisted the efforts of Martin Luther King in many ways, but finally this conversation was recorded, and I've heard the conversation. It was broadcast. Recorded. Kennedy says to Russell B. Long, what's happening down there? And Long talks about the oil men and this and that. And then he starts talking about a deal. There might be a deal coming. Now, the deal immediately triggered off in Kennedy's mind 1876, because that was the original deal of deals. Rutherford B. Hayes got the Southern vote by agreeing to withdraw federal troops from the South, thus ending black Reconstruction and initiating the period of Jim Crow. So Kennedy says, but this isn't 1876, because what happens is it will become the most publicized thing. Everybody's looking now. What is this president promising this group? Pretty soon you got the goddamnedest man. So Long goes back and forth, and he says a number of things, including the Negro vote might be the key vote. And JFK says, at least I could count it. I think it's crazy for the South, because this way I'm concerned about Georgia and Louisiana and these places. Here's where we've got a chance to carry them. But if I end up with no chance to carry them, then I got to go up north and try to do my business. That business was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Kennedy did not live long enough to push it through Congress. But Lyndon Johnson pushed it through Congress by saying that the one thing Congress would do to honor Kennedy's memory was to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And that's how it went through. So this is 1960, crucial period in which the Democratic Party became officially, legislatively enrolled in the civil rights procedures. And the reaction of the North may have been dependent on many things, but what I want to indicate is that the continuity of the Northern position on racial equality may have been a factor in this reversal. As you see, we've achieved the fact that the blue column, the blue states are now Democratic, the red states are Republican. Now, I wanted to show you very briefly an experimental approach to the ideological correlates of Inland North and Midland speech that I carried out. I took the speaker you heard before, Sabrina Kay from Detroit. I'm not going to play her again. And this is her vowel system. You find this extreme raising of air way up here, the fronting of short O, the backing of E, the backing of wedge, all those features of the northern cities. And then I took a speaker from Indianapolis, so I'm going to play her.
I read, and like most women, I like to go shopping and play card games with family and friends and that kind of thing. Nothing real exciting. We used to go camping quite a bit on the weekends, but our lives have shifted enough that we don't do that much right now. But that's what we do.
So what you hear from her is shopping and on the weekends, not shopping, and on the weekends. And the whole pattern is the contrasting Indianapolis pattern. Now, the subjects that I had here were 90 of them, and they were mostly from the Midland. This table shows you where the subjects who were listening to it, the students at Bloomington, were listening to this, and 58 of them were from the Midland, and the rest were just scattered here and there. So this is a Midland reaction. And this shows you how good they were at identifying the speakers. They were very good. 58 of them identify the speaker as coming from either Detroit or Chicago. And as you've seen, Detroit and Chicago are the same thing. And only 7 of them were confused and thought the speaker might have come from Indianapolis. And 31 of them were very clear on the fact that the Midland speaker was from Indianapolis or Indiana. So they were pretty good as a whole, much better than most people are in identifying dialects. They were really alert. And then they were asked questions. How friendly do you think this person is? How intelligent? How trustworthy? All the typical questions that we want to get when we want to get reactions to evaluating speakers. The only significant thing that came out in that series was friendly. The person you heard from Indiana was considered more friendly in a very significant way. But there were three other questions that I put on there, and one had to do with how favorable do you think the person would be to abortion, to gun control, and to affirmative action. And on this chart, you see the blue represents their reactions to the Detroit speaker, and the red to the Indianapolis speaker. The vertical axis is degree of approval they attributed to it, where the lower it is, the stronger the approval. And the three units are abortion, affirmative action, and gun control. The affirmative action gun control showed a significant attribution to the Northern Shift speaker of positive attitudes on these front. I don't take this experiment too seriously because it's not as controlled as I would like it to be, and it's not the type of experiment. These people varied in several different ways, but it is suggestive, and it, along with the other data put in front of you, it made me think that we can't entirely overlook the possibility of an ideological background to the Northern City Shift. Now, this account of Yankee cultural imperialism and the Northern City Shift is intended to explore the possibility that language change on a grand scale is associated with ideological factors that are partly responsible for its momentum and for the maintenance of the sharp division between the North and the Midland. The interface between language and society is not a broad one. Most of the determinants of change in language structure lie well below the surface, and social factors operate close to the surface, affecting words and sounds rather than the structures that lie within the Northern City Shift. Nevertheless, the close association between language and voting at the county level cannot easily be ignored. More controlled experiments and more detailed examinations of the border regions will eventually illuminate the question of how close and how strong that relationship is. Thanks.